Hey guys, have you ever wondered what silence sounds like when it stretches across miles of untouched snow? How heavy can cold become when it seeps through every crack, every breath, every hope of warmth? Tonight, we're stepping softly into the frost-laden world of the frontier, where winter wasn't just a season, it was a quiet adversary that tested every fiber of human endurance. Picture yourself drifting back through time, to an era when the nearest neighbor might be 20 miles away. When the only light came from firelight, and when survival meant a slow, methodical dance with nature's most unforgiving moods. This is a story of ordinary people facing extraordinary cold, of small victories measured in degrees of warmth, and of the strange beauty found in life's most challenging moments. If this kind of storytelling helps you rest, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it truly brings you peace. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and what time it is where you are. It's strangely comforting to see how many of us are drifting off together from different corners of the world. Now dim the lights, maybe switch on a gentle fan for that soothing background hum. And let's settle in for tonight's quiet journey through history. The morning arrives without ceremony, a pale gray suggestion of dawn filtering through the single oiled paper window of your cabin. You wake not to bird song or church bells, but to the sound of your own breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. The cabin walls creak and settle around you, contracting in the bitter cold. Each groan a reminder of how thin the barrier stands between you and the endless white expanse beyond. Your feet touch the rough-hewn floorboards and the cold shoots up through your legs like a physical force. The fire died sometime in the night. It always does, no matter how carefully you bank the coals. Now the hearth holds only gray ash and the faint memory of warmth. Your first task, before coffee, before washing, before acknowledging the new day properly, is to coax life back into those dead embers. Imagine yourself kneeling before that cold fireplace, your joints stiff from the chill that has settled deep into your bones. The tinder is damp. It's always damp during these endless winter months. Your fingers, already raw from yesterday's wood splitting, fumble with bark shavings and dried grass. The flint sparks once, twice, 3 times before catching. You breathe gently on the tiny flame, afraid to smother it with too much attention, afraid to let it die from too little. This ritual of resurrection, bringing fire back from near death, becomes the heartbeat of your winter days. Without it, everything else crumbles. Without warmth, the water bucket by the door turns to solid ice. Without heat, the meager supplies in your root cellar freeze and crack. Without fire, you simply don't survive. But keeping that fire alive demands a price that city dwellers could never imagine. The rhythm of your days revolves around wood, finding it, cutting it, hauling it, splitting it, stacking it, drying it. Even now, with snow 3 feet deep against your cabin walls, you know you must venture out into the biting wind to gather more fuel for the hungry flames. You pull on your coat, if you can call it that. It's more a collection of patches, sewn together with desperate hope, stuffed with whatever filling you could find. Goose down if you were fortunate enough to find a dead bird, cattail fluff if you were clever about autumn gathering, or simply layers of worn cloth if luck abandoned you entirely. Your boots are wrapped with strips of leather and cloth, bound tight against the snow that wants to creep inside and steal the feeling from your toes. The door opens with resistance. Ice has formed where moisture from your breath and cooking has frozen against the frame. You step outside into a world transformed into crystal silence. The snow crunches beneath your feet with a sound like breaking bones, and the cold hits your face like a physical slap. Your nose begins to run immediately, and you know that moisture will freeze to your face if you're not careful. The woodpile sits beneath a thin shelter you built last autumn, back when you still had hope that winter might be gentler this year. Snow has drifted against it anyway, and you must first dig through the white barrier to reach the logs beneath. Your axe handle feels like ice in your hands, even through your mittens. Mittens knitted from wool you traded for last summer. Wool that came from sheep you'll never see in a place that might as well be another world. Each swing of the axe sends shockwaves up your arms. Cold makes the wood harder, more resistant. Your breath forms great white clouds that obscure your vision, and soon ice crystals form on your eyelashes and the rough wool covering your mouth. Split stack carry. Split stack carry. The rhythm becomes meditative, almost hypnotic. A way of keeping your mind from dwelling on the burning in your lungs or the way your feet have gone numb inside your boots. You carry armloads of wood back to the cabin, each trip an expedition across the few yards that separate survival from catastrophe. The logs are heavy with cold, reluctant to catch fire, but eventually they surrender to the flames. You build the fire higher than you should, knowing you'll pay for this extravagance later. But craving the luxury of genuine warmth against your back, now comes breakfast, if you can dignify it with that name. Salt pork from the barrel by the door, so heavily salted it makes your mouth pucker and demands precious water to wash it down. Water that you must melt from ice, using wood that you must constantly replenish. Hardtack that's gone soft with moisture and must be fried crispy again to be palatable. Perhaps beans from your dwindling store, soaked overnight when you remembered, or cornmeal stirred into a thin gruel that fills your stomach without satisfying your hunger. You eat slowly, not from leisure, but from necessity. There isn't enough food to satisfy appetite, only enough to maintain life. Each bite is considered, each morsel savored not for its flavor, there's little enough of that, but for its promise of energy, of warmth generated from within. You've learned to distinguish between the different qualities of hunger, the sharp demand of a body that expects regular meals, the gnawing persistence of a body adapting to less, and the hollow ache of a body beginning to consume itself. The isolation weighs on you almost as heavily as the cold. Your nearest neighbor lives a hard day's walk through snow that might be knee-deep or waist-deep, depending on how the wind has carved the drifts. There are no casual visits during frontier winter, no dropping by for conversation or borrowed supplies. If you run out of something essential, salt, lamp oil, ammunition, you make do without. Or you risk everything on a journey that might cost you your life. Inside the cabin, the walls seem to press closer each day. You know every knot in every board, every gap where the chinking has worked loose and lets in the cold. You've counted the furniture not because there's so much of it, but because there's so little. A rough table, 2 chairs if you are fortunate, a chest for your few belongings, and the bed piled high with every blanket, quilt, and piece of cloth you own. The women's work continues even in the depths of winter. Imagine yourself, if you are the woman of the house, sitting close to the fire with mending that never seems to finish. Clothes wear out faster in this harsh environment, and everything must be repaired rather than replaced. Your fingers work by firelight, and what little illumination filters through the oiled paper window. Stitching patches onto patches, darning holes in stockings that are more thread than original wool. The sewing becomes a meditation, a way to keep your hands busy while your mind drifts to warmer places and better times. You remember, perhaps, the dress you wore to church back in the settlements? How the fabric felt against your skin? How you had choices about what to wear based on weather or occasion? Now you wear the same layered combination of garments day after day, week after week, adding pieces or removing them as the fire burns high or low. If you are the man of the house, your indoor tasks are equally endless. Tools must be maintained and repaired, for a broken axe handle or a dulled knife blade could mean disaster. You work by firelight, whittling new handles, sharpening edges on whatever stone you could find, trying to stretch your equipment through one more season. Your hands are permanently stained and scarred from this work, your fingers thick and clumsy from the constant cold. The children, if you are blessed and burdened with them, present their own challenges. You must be kept warm, fed, and occupied during the long months when outdoor play is impossible. They grow restless and quarrelsome, confined to the small space, and you must constantly balance their need for activity with the necessity of conserving heat and food. You teach them what you can: letters in the soot on the hearthstones, numbers counted out in beans, stories remembered from your own childhood to pass the endless evening hours. Night comes early and stays late during frontier winter. By 4 o'clock, the pale sun is already setting, and you face the long stretch until dawn. You've learned to measure time not by clocks, if you even possess one, but by the angle of light through the window, the behavior of the fire, the rhythm of meals and sleep. The darkness becomes a living thing, pressing against the cabin, seeping through the walls, making the small space feel both claustrophobic and terrifyingly exposed. The sounds of winter become your constant companions. The wind that never quite stops, sometimes a gentle whisper, sometimes a howling voice that seems to call your name. The settling of the cabin as timbers contract and expand. The soft hiss of snow against the oiled paper window. Underneath it all, the profound silence of a world locked in ice. where no birds sing, no insects hum, no distant voices carry on the air. You develop a new relationship with your body during these months. Every ache becomes significant, every small injury a potential catastrophe. A cut finger that might heal quickly in warm weather becomes a source of constant concern. A cough that would be merely annoying in civilization becomes a terror when you have no medicine, no doctor, no help beyond what you can provide for yourself. You learn to listen to your body with desperate attention, noting every change, every warning sign. The psychological weight of winter settles over you like another blanket. The sameness of each day blends into a dreamlike routine where time loses meaning. You wake, you tend to fire, you eat your meager breakfast. You struggle through the daily tasks of survival. You eat again, you tend the fire, you sleep. And then you wake and begin again. With the snow perhaps deeper, the cold perhaps sharper, but the routine absolutely unchanged. Yet within this harsh existence, you discover moments of unexpected beauty. The way frost forms intricate patterns on the single window, creating gardens of ice flowers that would shame any artist. The particular quality of silence after a fresh snowfall, when the world seems wrapped in cotton and every harsh edge has been softened. The perfect arch of your breath in the morning air, a small proof that you are still alive, still breathing, still fighting. You learn to find warmth in small victories, successfully lighting a fire on the first try. Discovering that yesterday's leftover gruel has frozen solid and can be fried into something resembling a pancake. Finding that your mittens have finally dried after 3 days hanging by the fire. These tiny triumphs become the highlights of your days, bright spots in an otherwise gray existence. Cold becomes a character in your life, as present and demanding as any human companion. You negotiate with it, bargain with it, sometimes surrender to it. You learn its moods. The dry cold that makes snow squeak underfoot. The wet cold that soaks through everything. The sharp cold that makes your breath catch in your throat. The deep cold that seems to freeze the very air around you. Your relationship with food transforms completely. Every grain of corn, every strip of dried meat, every spoonful of lard becomes precious beyond measure. You plan meals days in advance, calculating how to stretch supplies, how to extract the maximum nutrition from minimum ingredients. You dream about food, not elaborate feasts, but simple abundance. Fresh bread, sweet milk, vegetables that aren't pickled or dried beyond recognition. It's an apple, a piece of cheese. Luxuries that have become as fantastical as fairy tales. Water, that most basic necessity, becomes a daily struggle. Wells freeze solid. Streams disappear beneath ice too thick to break easily. You melt snow by the potful, watching precious fuel disappear into the temporary luxury of liquid water. You ration it carefully, using the same water first for cooking, then for washing dishes, finally, for the weekly luxury of washing your hands and face. The winter changes how you think about everything. Distance is measured, not in miles, but in danger. Time is measured not in hours, but in how long the fire will burn. Wealth is measured not in coins, but in how many days your supplies will last. You develop a frontier mathematics where everything is calculated against survival. As the weeks stretch into months, you begin to understand why some settlers simply disappeared during winter. Not just from cold or hunger, though those claimed many lives, but from the crushing weight of isolation. From the daily grind of small failures and smaller victories. From the psychological challenge of maintaining hope when each dawn brings nothing but more of the same struggle. But you endure. You endure because the alternative is unthinkable. You endure because spring, however distant, remains a possibility. You endure because the human spirit, when pressed against the absolute edge of survival, reveals reserves of strength that surprise even its owner. The rhythm of your days becomes a kind of prayer, a repeated affirmation of your intention to continue. The fire, the food, the endless small repairs and preparations that keep catastrophe at bay. Each task performed with the careful attention of ritual, each small success savored like a blessing, each night survived a small victory against the vast, cold indifference of winter. And in the deep quiet of those long winter nights, when the fire burns low and the cold presses close, you sometimes find a strange peace in the simplicity of it all. Your world has contracted to these few basic needs: warmth, food, shelter, and the precious company of any family members who share this exile with you. In the midst of deprivation, you discover what truly matters, what is genuinely essential for human existence. The silence of winter is heavy, but strangely protective. The cold itself becomes a companion of sorts, a reminder of your own smallness beneath the vast frontier sky. And in that smallness, that vulnerability, you find a peculiar strength, a quiet determination to wake tomorrow and begin again the ancient human dance with survival. The winter nights stretch endlessly, filled with sounds that become part of your consciousness. The constant whisper of wind, finding every gap in your carefully constructed shelter. The soft percussion of snow against oiled paper, sometimes gentle as fingertips, sometimes insistent as thrown pebbles. The crack and pop of cabin timbers adjusting to the cold, each sound making you wonder if this will be the night something gives way entirely. You learn to sleep differently in frontier winter. Not the deep, trusting sleep of civilization, but the light, alert rest of prey animals. Part of your mind always listens for changes, the fire dying too quickly, the wind shifting to a dangerous direction, a subtle sound that might mean wolves circling your small outbuilding where you keep what livestock survived the autumn slaughter. Sleep becomes fragmented, broken into pieces by the need to tend the fire, to check that the cold hasn't found some new way into your sanctuary. Your dreams, when they come, are often cruel. You dream of warmth, summer afternoons when sweat was a complaint, not a distant memory. You dream of abundance, tables groaning under the weight of fresh bread, roasted meat, vegetables that still hold the taste of sunlight. You dream of company, voices other than your own family's, laughter that isn't forced or desperate, conversations about topics beyond mere survival. Then you wake to the gray half-light of winter dawn, and reality settles over you like a cold, wet blanket. The relationship between family members grows intense during these months of forced proximity. Every habit becomes magnified, every small irritation expanded by the impossibility of escape. The way your husband clears his throat by the fire, the way your wife hums the same 3 songs over and over while she works, the way the children's voices rise in the small space, until they seem to fill every corner with noise. You love these people desperately, but you also sometimes fantasize about walking out into the snow and not coming back, just to escape the suffocating closeness. Yet this same proximity also creates bonds stronger than steel. When your youngest develops a fever that won't break, the family becomes a single organism focused on survival. When a blizzard howls for 3 days straight and the cabin shakes like a ship in a storm, you huddle together, sharing breath, sharing warmth, sharing the quiet terror that none of you speaks aloud. These shared trials forge connections that will last lifetimes, creating stories that will be told around fires decades later. When winter is once again just a season to be weathered, rather than a force to be survived, the monotony becomes almost hallucinogenic. Days blend into weeks without significant variation, creating a dreamlike state where you sometimes lose track of time entirely. Was it yesterday or last week that you saw those rabbit tracks near the woodpile? How many times have you mended that same torn seam in your coat? The calendar, if you have one, becomes meaningless. Time is measured instead by the height of snow against the cabin walls, by how many logs remain in your carefully hoarded pile, by the growing hollowness in your cheeks reflected in the small mirror you use for shaving or pinning hair. Food becomes not just sustenance, but entertainment, comfort, and hope. You find yourself thinking about meals for hours, planning how to make the salt pork last another week, remembering the texture and taste of foods you may never eat again. An egg becomes a celebration worth savoring for days in anticipation. A spoonful of honey, hoarded since autumn, becomes a treasure to be parceled out, drop by precious drop. You develop elaborate rituals around eating, ways to make the meager portions seem more substantial. Techniques for fooling your stomach into feeling satisfied. The children adapt to this strange life with the resilience of young creatures, but also with losses that break your heart. They forget what it feels like to run freely outdoors. They accept hunger as normal, never asking for more food because they've learned there isn't more to be had. They play quiet games designed not to waste energy, creating elaborate fantasy worlds from scraps of fabric and broken tools. Their laughter, when it comes, sounds thin and fragile in the cold air. You watch them and feel the weight of what you've chosen for them. This life of hardship and deprivation, this education and suffering that no child should have to receive. Yet you also see them developing strengths that children in comfortable homes will never possess. They learn to value small comforts, to find joy in simple pleasures, to endure without complaint hardships that would break adults who never learned to bend. The isolation does strange things to your mind. You begin talking to yourself, then talking to objects. The fire, the cooking pot, the stubborn door that sticks with ice every morning. You have long conversations with people who aren't there, family members back in the settlements, neighbors you knew years ago, even strangers you imagine might someday visit. These phantom conversations become so real that you sometimes catch yourself listening for responses that will never come. You develop superstitions born from desperation and the human need to find patterns in chaos. If you split the kindling just so, the fire will burn longer. If you eat your meager breakfast in a particular order, the day will bring some small luck. If you check the supplies 3 times instead of 2, somehow they'll last longer. These rituals provide a sense of control. In a situation where control is largely illusion, but the comfort they offer is real enough. The physical transformation is gradual, but undeniable. Your body adapts to the cold, developing layers of fat when food permits. It's growing more hair, learning to conserve heat in ways you never understood before. Your hands become permanently roughened, scarred from the constant work with wood and metal and fire. Your face takes on the weathered look of someone who lives exposed to the elements, skin tough as leather, eyes that squint against the glare of sun on snow. But it's the internal transformation that surprises you most. You discover reserves of patience you never knew you possessed, ability to endure discomfort that would have seemed impossible in your former life. You learn to find satisfaction in the smallest improvements to your situation, to celebrate victories measured in degrees of warmth or ounces of food. You develop an intimate knowledge of your own limitations and capabilities. Understanding exactly how far you can push yourself before breaking, the winter teaches lessons that no book could convey. You learn that civilization is a thin veneer over the fundamental struggle for survival. You understand that most human worries are luxuries, affordable only to those whose basic needs are secure. You discover that the line between life and death is often measured in small decisions, such as how much wood to burn tonight, whether to venture out in threatening weather, or how to ration supplies that must last until spring. As winter deepens and the coldest months arrive, even your adapted routine faces new challenges. The cold becomes so severe that your breath freezes instantly, creating ice masks on your face. Water freezes solid within minutes of being brought inside. The wind carries a bite that seems to cut through every layer of protection you've devised. These are the days when you understand why some settlers didn't survive. When survival becomes a matter of pure will, as much as preparation or skill. Yet even in these darkest months, there are moments that remind you why humans persist in impossible places. The way firelight dances on the cabin walls, creating warmth that's as much about light as heat. The perfect silence that follows a fresh snowfall when the world seems reborn in crystal purity. The fierce satisfaction of successfully completing another day's worth of survival tasks, of earning another night's shelter from the cold, and always underlying everything else, there's the promise of spring. You carry it with you like a secret treasure, this knowledge that winter is not permanent, that somewhere beyond the gray sky and endless snow, warmth is waiting to return. This hope becomes a kind of fuel, sustaining you through the darkest days, giving meaning to the daily struggle of staying alive. The rhythm of your days becomes a quiet prayer repeated endlessly. Survive this hour, this day, this week. Let the fire burn, let the food last, let the shelter hold, let spring come again. In this simple litany, you find a peace deeper than comfort, a strength more lasting than warmth, a faith more powerful than certainty. As the pale winter light shifts and softens, let us drift from the general struggle of frontier survival to follow one particular life through the snows of history. Her name was Narcissa Prentice Whitman, and in 1836, she became one of the first white women to cross the Rocky Mountains into the Oregon Territory. But it is not her famous journey that draws us to her story tonight. It is the quiet winters that followed, the long seasons of cold and isolation that tested her spirit in ways no trail could match. Picture her first, not as the pioneer legend she would become, but as a young woman of 28, raised in the relative comfort of Prattsburg, New York. She had known winter, certainly the organized, civilized winters of an established community where wood was delivered to your door, where neighbors lived close enough to visit, where cold was an inconvenience rather than a constant threat to existence. She had taught school, sung in the church choir, lived the measured life of an educated woman in a town where the rhythms of seasons followed predictable patterns. The call to missionary work came to her like a distant melody, growing stronger over months and years until she could no longer ignore it. She felt drawn to carry Christianity to the indigenous peoples of the Oregon Territory, that vast and largely unmapped region beyond the Rocky Mountains. It was a noble calling, one that would require her to leave behind everything familiar and comfortable. What she could not have imagined was how thoroughly the wilderness would strip away not just physical comfort, but the very foundations of who she believed herself to be. In 1835, she married Marcus Whitman, a doctor and fellow missionary she had known for only a few months. Their courtship was conducted largely through letters, a romance built on shared faith and common purpose, rather than deep personal knowledge. Marcus was 11 years her senior, a practical man who understood the hardships they would face, but perhaps underestimated the psychological toll those hardships would exact on his young bride. Their wedding was both a celebration and a farewell, for they knew they were leaving civilization behind, possibly forever. The journey west in 1836 was an adventure that captured the imagination of the entire nation. Narcissa and her traveling companion, Eliza Spaulding, became famous as the first white women to cross the Continental Divide. They traveled by covered wagon as far as possible, then on horseback through mountain passes where no wagon could go. Narcissa wrote letters describing the magnificent scenery, the strange customs of their Indian guides, the daily challenges of life on the trail. Her words painted pictures of excitement and discovery of a young woman embracing adventure with enthusiasm and faith. But those letters, written in the warmth of summer travel, could not prepare her for what winter would bring to the mission they established in the Cayuse, territory of present-day Washington. The Whitman Mission, built near the Walla Walla River, became their home in November of 1836, just as the first snows began to dust the surrounding hills. It was a modest compound, a few log buildings, a garden plot already dormant for the season, and around them, the vast silence of a wilderness preparing for its long sleep. Imagine Narcissa in those first weeks, still buoyed by the success of their journey, still energized by the romance of their mission. She threw herself into the work of establishing their new life, with the determination of someone who believes that faith and effort can overcome any obstacle. She organized their supplies, planned their meals, began learning the Cayuse language with the intensity of someone who sees linguistic barriers as merely temporary inconveniences. The mission house was larger than a typical frontier cabin, but it was still a rough structure by the standards Narcissa had known. Chinks between the logs let in drafts that could never be completely eliminated. The windows were small and covered with oiled paper rather than glass. The floors were uneven planks that creaked with every step. Most challenging of all, the house had been designed by men who understood function, but had little appreciation for the small comforts that make a dwelling feel like a home. Narcissa spent her first weeks trying to transform their rough quarters into something resembling the domestic spaces. She, remembered from New York, she arranged their few pieces of furniture. A table Marcus had constructed from rough-hewn boards, 2 wooden chairs that wobbled on the uneven floor, a chest that held their most precious possessions to create conversation areas and workspaces. She hung their few decorative items on pegs driven between the logs, a small mirror that had survived the journey west, a watercolor painting of her childhood. Home a sampler she had embroidered as a girl with the words "God bless our home" stitched in careful letters. But no amount of arranging could disguise the fundamental reality of their situation. They were living in what was essentially a fort, designed for survival rather than comfort. The thick log walls that protected them from winter storms also created a sense of enclosure that could feel oppressive during the longest days. The small windows, practical for conserving heat, made their interior spaces perpetually dim. Even at midday, they often needed candles to read or do close work. As winter deepened, Narcissa began to understand the true nature of the isolation they had chosen. During their summer journey, there had always been the next day's travel to anticipate. New sights to see, problems to solve through movement. Now they were stationary, committed to this place through months of cold and snow. The nearest white settlements were hundreds of miles away across mountain passes that would be impassable until spring. They were entirely dependent on their own resources and the uncertain friendship of the local Cayuse people. The Cayuse themselves presented a complex challenge that Narcissa had not fully anticipated. They were not the eager converts to Christianity that she had imagined. Many were skeptical of the missionaries' presence, viewing them as harbingers of the white settlement that would eventually disrupt their traditional ways of life. Others were curious about the Christian message, but had their own deeply held spiritual beliefs that they were not eager to abandon. Some were welcoming and helpful, sharing knowledge about surviving in their harsh environment. Others remained distant, watching the missionaries with eyes that seemed to measure and evaluate their every action. Chief Tilaukaked, one of the most influential leaders among the local Cayuse, visited the mission regularly during those first winter months. He was a man of perhaps 50 years, with graying hair braided with shells and beads, and eyes that seemed to hold depths of knowledge about this land that Narcissa was only beginning to comprehend. He spoke some English, learned from earlier contacts with traders, and he often engaged Marcus in long conversations about the missionaries' intentions and methods. During these visits, Narcissa observed the subtle dynamics of respect and wariness that characterized the relationship between the Cayuse and the missionaries. Tilaukaked would accept their hospitality, sharing meals, warming himself by their fire, but she could sense his careful evaluation of their every word and action. He was particularly interested in Marcus's medical knowledge. Having seen demonstrations of the doctor's ability to treat injuries and illnesses, but he remained skeptical about their religious message, especially their claims about the superiority of Christian beliefs over traditional Cayuse spirituality. Narcissa's attempts to learn the Cayuse language proved more difficult than she had expected. These were not simple vocabulary lessons, but attempts to bridge entirely different ways of understanding the world. Concepts that seemed fundamental to her, linear time, individual property, the relationship between God and humanity, had no direct equivalents in Cayuse culture. She spent hours with patient teachers, struggling to communicate ideas that seemed to dissolve the moment she tried to translate them. One of her most devoted language instructors was a woman named Tilaukaked, perhaps 10 years older than Narcissa, who had several children and seemed to understand the challenges facing a young woman trying to adapt to life in unfamiliar surroundings. Tilaukaked would arrive at the mission in the afternoons, often bringing her youngest child, a boy of perhaps 3 years who would play quietly while the women worked on language lessons. These sessions became windows into Cayuse culture that formal missionary training could never have provided. Through Tilaukaked's patient instruction, Narcissa began to understand that the Cayuse relationship with the natural world was based on principles of reciprocity and respect that were far more complex than her initial impressions had suggested. When Tilaukaked taught her the names for plants and animals, she also explained their roles in Cayuse spiritual beliefs, their uses for food and medicine, their significance in the seasonal cycles that govern tribal life. The winter work at the mission was unlike anything in Narcissa's previous experience. There were no clear divisions between sacred and secular labor, no separation between her roles as missionary, housewife, teacher, and nurse. She found herself grinding grain by hand for their daily bread, tending fires that could not be allowed to die, washing clothes in water that had to be heated over those same precious fires. Her hands, which had once been soft from a life of relatively gentle work, became rough and cracked from the constant exposure to cold water, lye soap, and harsh weather. The daily routine of maintaining their household became a complex choreography of efficiency and conservation. Narcissa learned to bank their fires each night so that coals would survive until morning, eliminating the need to restart flames from scratch. She developed systems for heating water that would serve multiple purposes: warming the house, providing steam for cooking, creating hot water for washing. She learned to coordinate her cooking activities so that the heat from bread baking would also warm their living spaces and provide hot water for cleaning. Food preparation became a daily meditation on scarcity and gratitude. Their supplies had to last through the winter without any possibility of replenishment. Narcissa learned to stretch their store of flour by mixing it with ground roots and seeds. The Cayuse women taught her to identify and prepare, She discovered ways to make their precious sugar last by learning to appreciate the subtle sweetness of maple sap and dried berries. Salt, that most basic preservative, had to be used so sparingly that their food often tasted flat and unsatisfying. The meals themselves became exercises in creativity and patience. Salt pork appeared on their table in countless variations as Narcissa learned to disguise its overwhelming presence with whatever wild herbs and seasonings she could gather and preserve. Beans, their most reliable source of protein, required hours of soaking and cooking over fires that needed constant attention. Cornmeal became not just an ingredient but a foundation. Transformed into mush, bread, cakes, and gruels that provided sustenance, if not variety. Narcissa developed a particular pride in her bread making, on skill that became both practical necessity and artistic expression. Working with their temperamental oven, a clay structure that Marcus had built into one wall of their main room, she learned to judge temperatures by the color of flames to time, her baking by the shadows moving across their small windows to adjust her recipes based on the moisture content of their flour and the behavior of her sourdough starter. The bread itself became a symbol of civilization maintained in the wilderness, a daily affirmation that they could create something beautiful and nourishing, even under the most challenging circumstances. On successful baking days, when the loaves emerged golden and fragrant from the oven, Narcissa felt a satisfaction that went beyond mere accomplishment. She was maintaining traditions, preserving skills, creating something that connected her to the long line of women who had sustained their families through difficult times. Narcissa kept a journal throughout these months. Her entries reveal the gradual transformation of an enthusiastic young missionary into someone learning the deeper lessons of endurance. Early entries are filled with optimism and detailed observations about their work among the Cayuse. She writes about small successes in language learning, about Cayuse children who seem interested in her teaching, about moments when she feels she is making progress toward their goal of bringing Christianity to this remote place. But as winter deepened, her entries become more introspective, more aware of her own limitations and the magnitude of their isolation. She writes about the physical challenges, the constant cold that makes every task more difficult the way. Her breath forms clouds inside. They are inadequately heated house, the chilblains that develop on her fingers and toes despite her best efforts to stay warm. She describes the sound of wind around their buildings, a constant presence that sometimes whispers and sometimes howls, but never entirely stops. More revealing are her comments about the psychological challenges of their situation. She writes about missing her family with an intensity that surprises her, about dreaming of her mother's voice and her sister's laughter. She describes the strange experience of being surrounded by people, the Cayuse who visit their mission, yet feeling profoundly alone because of the language and cultural barriers that separate them. She admits to moments of doubt, not about their mission's importance, but about her own adequacy for the enormous task they have undertaken. The correspondence with her family back in New York became a lifeline that sustained her through the darkest months. She wrote long letters by candlelight, describing her daily life in careful detail, partly to help her family understand her experience, but partly to maintain her own connection to the person she had been before coming to Oregon. These letters were written knowing they would not be sent until spring, when traveling became possible again. In the meantime, they piled up like messages in bottles, waiting for some distant ship to carry them back to civilization. In her letters, Narcissa reveals the small victories that sustained her through the long winter. Successfully baking bread in their temperamental oven, learning to understand a new Cayuse word or phrase, nursing Marcus through a bout of influenza that left him weak and dependent on her care for weeks, teaching a group of Cayuse children to sing a simple hymn. These modest accomplishments became the highlights of days that might otherwise have been marked only by the slow passage of time. The relationship between Narcissa and Marcus deepened during these months of shared isolation. They had married as relative strangers united by common purpose, but winter at the mission forged them into genuine partners. They learned each other's rhythms and habits, developed systems for sharing the work of survival, created private jokes and observations that helped them maintain their sanity in the midst of such profound isolation. Marcus's practical skills complemented Narcissa's social abilities, while her resilience sustained them both through his moments of discouragement. Their evening conversations by the fireplace became treasured rituals that gave structure and meaning to days that might otherwise have blurred together in monotonous repetition. Marcus would share his observations about their Cayuse neighbors, his thoughts about medical treatments for the various ailments he encountered, his plans for expanding their mission activities when spring returned. Narcissa would describe her language lessons, her experiments with cooking and preservation, her ideas about how to better serve the women and children in the Cayuse community. Yet their relationship also faced strains that would have been impossible to anticipate. Constant proximity, the shared responsibilities, the complete dependence on each other for intellectual and emotional stimulation. All of this created pressures that tested their still new marriage. They had disagreements about how to approach their work with the Cayuse, about how to ration their supplies, about whether to attempt certain activities during the worst weather. These conflicts, minor though they might seem, took on magnified importance when there was no escape from each other's company. No way to cool tensions through temporary separation. During one particularly difficult period in January, when a series of blizzards kept them confined to their house for nearly 2 weeks, tensions reached a breaking point. Marcus had been struggling with a persistent cough that left him exhausted and irritable. Narcissa was dealing with her own bout of winter melancholy, a depression that seemed to deepen with each gray day of confinement. Their usual patterns of conversation and shared activity began to feel forced and artificial. The crisis came over something trivial. A disagreement about whether to use some of their precious candles for evening reading or save them for emergency lighting. But the argument escalated into a more fundamental discussion about their different approaches to risk and conservation, their different ways of coping with stress and uncertainty. For the first time since their marriage, they went to bed angry, lying side by side in their narrow bed without speaking, listening to the wind howl around their cabin walls. The resolution came gradually, through small acts of kindness and understanding that rebuilt their partnership stronger than before. Marcus surprised Narcissa by rising early to light the fires and prepare breakfast, giving her a few extra minutes of warmth under their heavy quilts. Narcissa responded by spending extra time preparing Marcus's favorite meal, using some of their carefully hoarded spices to make their simple fare more appetizing. They talked through their differences with the careful attention of people who understood that their survival depended not just on physical resources, but on maintaining their emotional connection to each other. Narcissa's teaching work continued throughout the winter, but it took forms she had never expected. Rather than formal lessons in a schoolhouse, she found herself offering instruction wherever opportunities arose. While working alongside Cayuse women, while sharing meals, while providing basic medical care to those who trusted the missionaries enough to seek their help. She taught children to form letters in the dirt floor of their cabin, using sticks as pencils and her finger as a pointer. She led singing sessions around their fireplace, teaching hymns that the Cayuse learned to sing in their own language, creating musical bridges across cultural divides. These informal teaching moments often proved more effective than any structured lesson plan could have been. When young Cayuse visitors showed interest in her books, Narcissa would demonstrate the mystery of reading by pointing to words and speaking their meanings aloud. When mothers brought sick children to the mission, she would teach simple English phrases related to health and comfort while providing care. When groups gathered around their fire on cold evenings, she would tell Bible stories using simple language and dramatic gestures to convey meanings that transcended linguistic barriers. The medical work became particularly important during the winter months, when illnesses that might be minor inconveniences in warmer weather became serious threats to survival. Narcissa learned to prepare simple remedies from their limited supplies, to tend fevers with cool cloths and constant care, to comfort the worried families of sick children. These experiences taught her that ministry was not just about preaching and teaching, but about demonstrating love through practical service during times of crisis. As the winter progressed toward its deepest, coldest months, Narcissa began to understand something profound about the nature of faith under extreme circumstances. The comfortable certainties she had brought from New York, clear distinctions between right and wrong, simple solutions to complex problems, confidence in her own ability to help others, gradually gave way to something more flexible and humble. She learned that survival itself could be a form of worship, that endurance could be a kind of prayer. The daily acts of caring for Marcus and maintaining their household were as sacred as any formal religious observance. The Cayuse people, who had initially seemed like the objects of her missionary work, gradually became her teachers in this harsh environment. They showed her which plants could provide nutrition during the hungry months of late winter, how to prepare foods that would sustain energy during cold weather, how to read the subtle signs that predicted changes in weather patterns. More importantly, he demonstrated a kind of patience and acceptance that challenged her own assumptions about how people should respond to hardship. The long evenings by their fireplace became times of deep conversation and quiet reflection. Marcus and Narcissa talked about their families, their childhoods, their dreams for the future of their mission. They read aloud from their few books, making each volume last as long as possible by reading slowly and discussing every chapter. They planned improvements to their buildings and grounds, sketching designs for additions and gardens that would make their isolated outposts feel more like a permanent home. But perhaps most importantly, they talked about what they were learning about themselves during these months of testing. Narcissa discovered reserves of physical strength she had never known she possessed. She learned that she could work with her hands for hours without complaint, could adapt to discomfort that would have seemed unbearable in her previous life, could maintain hope and good humor even when their situation seemed most desperate. She found that her faith, rather than being weakened by hardship, was being refined and strengthened through direct experience of dependence on forces beyond her control. The isolation also gave her time for kinds of thinking that had been impossible during their busy journey. West or their hectic first months at the mission, she had hours to contemplate the landscape around them, to appreciate the stark beauty of snow-covered hills and frozen rivers. She developed a deep appreciation for small pleasures, the way firelight played on the cabin walls, the taste of hot tea on a cold morning, the satisfaction of completing a difficult piece of mending or successfully preparing a nourishing meal from simple ingredients. As February gave way to March and the first hints of spring began to appear in longer daylight hours and occasional warm afternoons, Narcissa reflected on how profoundly the winter had changed her. She was no longer the optimistic young woman who had arrived at the mission full of confidence about her ability to transform the lives of the Cayuse people. Instead, she had become someone who understood that transformation was a mutual process, that she had been changed as much by her encounter with this place and these people as they had been changed by her presence. The winter had taught her lessons about patience, endurance, and the complex nature of human relationships that no amount of formal education could have provided. She had learned to find meaning in small daily tasks, to appreciate the company of her husband in new ways, to respect the wisdom of people whose way of life was entirely different from her own. Most importantly, she had discovered that faith was not a simple matter of believing certain things, but a way of living with uncertainty, of maintaining hope when circumstances seemed hopeless, finding purpose in the midst of hardship. When spring finally arrived and the snow began to melt, revealing the brown earth beneath, Narcissa felt a complicated mix of relief and loss. She was grateful for the return of warmth and the promise of renewed contact with the outside world. But she also knew that something precious had been forged during those long winter months, a deeper understanding of herself, more mature faith, and a love for this harsh but beautiful place that would sustain her through all the challenges that lay ahead. The winter had ended, but its lessons would remain with her forever, woven into the fabric of who she had become through the quiet crucible of survival, patience, and gradual transformation. As night deepens and our journey through time grows quieter still, let us drift into the realm of mysteries, those silent questions left behind in abandoned cabins, sewn into forgotten quilts, and buried beneath layers of snow and years. The frontier winter holds secrets that archaeologists still uncover, stories that emerge from root cellars and collapsed chimneys like whispers from another world. In museums across the American Midwest and West, glass cases hold fragments of lives lived and lost during those harsh winter months. A child's mitten, perfectly preserved in the dry cold of an abandoned cabin's loft. A wooden bowl, carved with infinite patience during long winter evenings, still bearing the marks of the knife that shaped it. A quilt square, half finished, with the needles still caught in mid-stitch, as if the seamstress had merely stepped away for a moment and would return to complete her work. These objects speak in a language older than words, telling stories of adaptation, creativity, and quiet desperation. Consider the quilts, those masterpieces of necessity that have become symbols of frontier ingenuity. Each square represents a small victory over waste, a transformation of worn clothing and fabric scraps into something both beautiful and functional. But look closer at these surviving examples, and you'll discover mysteries that historians are still trying to unravel. Why do some quilts from the frontier period contain fabric that clearly came from expensive silk dresses? Garments that seem impossibly luxurious for people living in such harsh conditions. The answer lies in the complex stories of loss and adaptation that winter forced upon frontier families. That silk might have been from a wedding dress, carefully preserved through the difficult journey west, only to be cut apart during a particularly harsh winter, when warmth mattered more than sentiment. Or it might have come from the dress of a woman who died during childbirth, transformed by grieving hands into something that could provide comfort to the living. The patterns themselves hold clues to lives we can barely imagine. Some quilts show evidence of being taken apart and resewn multiple times, their original patterns altered to accommodate new needs or available materials. Others display a mixture of traditional patterns from the East combined with improvised designs that seem to have been invented on the spot. These hybrid patterns represent more than just textile art, they're maps of cultural adaptation, showing how people maintained connections to their past while creating new traditions suited to their harsh present. In the quilting rooms of historical societies, researchers have found quilts that contain hidden messages. Pieces of fabric arranged in patterns that spelled out names, dates, or even simple messages of love and hope. Some of these textile letters were never discovered by their intended recipients, remaining buried in the cloth for decades until patient historians learned to read their silent language. One quilt, found in the ruins of a Montana homestead, contains a pattern that, when viewed from a specific angle, clearly spells out Mary Loves John, 1862. A message of devotion sewn into the fabric that would warm them through the bitter winter months. Quilts are only one category of the mysterious objects that frontier winters left behind. In the ruins of cabins scattered across the northern plains, archaeologists regularly uncover items that tell stories of creative survival. Homemade snowshoes woven from strips of rawhide and bent wood, each pair uniquely crafted to fit specific feet and specific snow conditions. Some show evidence of multiple repairs, patches upon patches, suggesting they were used season after season until they literally fell apart from exhaustion. The variety of these survival tools is remarkable. Some settlers created ice cleats by driving nails through wooden boards and strapping them to their boots. Others carved ice chisels from broken metal tools, fashioning handles that would allow them to break through frozen streams and wells. The creativity shown in these adaptations suggests long hours spent thinking about problems, discussing solutions around winter fires, testing and refining designs during the endless months when outdoor work was limited. But the need for better tools was constant. Perhaps most intriguing are the objects that seem to have served no practical purpose. The mysterious carvings, decorative items, and artistic creations that frontier families made during the long winter evenings. In one cabin in North Dakota, archaeologists found a collection of wooden figurines, each no larger than a finger, carved with extraordinary detail and care. They represent families, men, women, children, even dogs and cats. But they don't match any known family that lived in the cabin. Were they meant to represent the families the settlers had left behind? Were they toys for children, or comfort objects for adults overwhelmed by loneliness? The figurines raise more questions than they answer, offering glimpses into the emotional lives of people whose daily struggles we can document, but whose inner worlds remain largely hidden. The root cellars of frontier homesteads hold their own mysteries. These underground chambers, dug to preserve food through the winter months, sometimes contain more than just the expected jars of preserved vegetables and stored grains. Archaeologists have found collections of stones arranged in patterns that seem deliberately meaningful, but whose significance has been lost to time. They've uncovered caches of seeds wrapped in cloth, sometimes varieties of plants that weren't native to the local area, suggesting that settlers carried botanical hopes from distant places and carefully preserved them through harsh winters. One particularly intriguing discovery came from a collapsed root cellar in Wyoming, where researchers found dozens of small ceramic jars, each containing a different type of dried plant material. Chemical analysis revealed that these weren't food items, but rather a collection of medicinal herbs, some native to the local area, and others that must have been carried from far away. The collection included plants used for treating fever, digestive problems, respiratory ailments, and even some that were known to have mild sedative properties, perhaps used to help children sleep during the long, frightening winter nights. But it's the arrangement of these jars that creates the mystery. They were found organized in a specific pattern, with certain herbs grouped together in ways that don't match any known medical practices of the time. Some historians speculate that this represents a kind of folk medicine that blended traditional European herbal knowledge with Native American practices learned through contact with local tribes. Others wonder if the arrangement itself held meaning, perhaps a system for remembering which herbs to use for which conditions, created by someone who could read or write, but had developed a visual system for preserving crucial medical knowledge. The mystery deepens when we consider the personal items found alongside these medicinal collections. In the Wyoming root cellar, researchers also discovered a small wooden box containing what appeared to be children's teeth, carefully wrapped in pieces of cloth. Some of the cloth bore traces of embroidery, suggesting these weren't just random storage materials, but pieces of clothing that held special meaning. The teeth themselves had been preserved with extraordinary care, some showing evidence of having been kept in small individual containers before being gathered together. This discovery raises haunting questions about the lives and losses of frontier families. Were these teeth saved as mementos of children who didn't survive the harsh winter conditions? Were they kept as talismans, perhaps following some folk belief about protection or remembrance? Or do they represent something else entirely, a practice whose meaning has been completely lost to time? The teeth remain in museum storage, still wrapped in their faded cloth, still holding their secrets. The chimneys of ruined frontier cabins often yield their own archaeological treasures. These structures, built to last, and often remaining standing long after the wooden walls have rotted away, sometimes contain hidden caches placed there during the winter months. Families would hide valuable items in the chimney walls, using loose stones that could be removed and replaced. Over the years, archaeologists have found coins, jewelry, letters, and even more mysterious objects hidden in these improvised safes. One of the most puzzling chimney discoveries came from a homestead in Kansas, where researchers found a collection of carved wooden discs, each about the size of a silver dollar, hidden in a cavity behind the firebox. The discs are carved with symbols that don't match any known writing system. It's not English letters, not numbers, not any Native American pictographs from the region. Some historians believe they might represent a private code developed by the family, perhaps for keeping track of supplies or important dates. Others speculate they could be gaming pieces for some now-forgotten entertainment that help pass the long winter evenings. The symbols themselves are hauntingly beautiful, spirals and crossed lines. Small circles connected by curved marks, patterns that seem almost like writing but remain completely indecipherable. Carbon dating places them firmly in the frontier period, and where patterns on the wood suggest they were handled frequently, perhaps used regularly for whatever purpose they served. They rest now in a university collection, still keeping their secrets, still challenging researchers to unlock their meaning. Beyond these physical mysteries lie the cultural practices that frontier winters fostered. Traditions and beliefs that emerged from the unique pressures of isolation and survival. Historical records hint at customs that developed around winter activities, rituals that helped families maintain their sanity and their humanity during the darkest months. Some of these practices were documented in diaries and letters, but others survive only in fragments, half-remembered stories passed down through generations of families that eventually moved away from the frontier. One recurring theme in frontier winter folklore is the belief in protective spirits associated with warmth and light. Many families developed elaborate rituals around their fires, treating the hearth not just as a source of heat, but as something almost sacred. Some settlers would save a piece of wood from their Christmas fire to use for starting fires during particularly dangerous storms, believing it carried special protective power. Others would place small offerings near the fireplace, a bit of food, a flower preserved from summer, even a child's drawing as thanks for the warmth that kept their families alive. These practices blended elements from various traditions. European settlers brought memories of hearth spirits and household gods, beliefs that fire was sacred and needed to be treated with respect and gratitude. Contact with Native American tribes introduced new ideas about the spiritual power of elements, the importance of maintaining balance with natural forces, and the value of ceremony in difficult times. The harsh realities of frontier winter created conditions where these different belief systems could merge into something new, a folk spirituality adapted specifically to the challenges of survival and extreme isolation. The winter storytelling traditions of frontier families created another layer of cultural mystery. With no books beyond perhaps a Bible and an almanac, Families relied on oral traditions to entertain themselves during the long, dark months. But the stories that developed during these sessions weren't just retellings of familiar tales. Isolation and the strange conditions of frontier winter fostered the creation of new stories. Legends that emerged from the specific experiences of people living on the edge of survival. Some of these stories were clearly functional. Tales that contained practical information about surviving winter emergencies. Coded as entertainment to help children remember crucial details. Others seemed to serve psychological purposes, helping families process the fears and anxieties that came with their isolated situation. Many frontier stories from this period feature characters who get lost in snowstorms, but are guided to safety by mysterious helpers, animals with unusual intelligence lights that appear when needed most, voices that call through the wind with helpful warnings. The consistency of certain elements across stories from different regions suggests that frontier winter created its own mythology. A shared body of beliefs about the supernatural aspects of surviving extreme cold and isolation. These stories often feature themes of hidden help. The idea that people in desperate situations would receive assistance from unexpected sources. Whether these tales reflected actual experiences, psychological coping mechanisms, or simply the human need to find hope in hopeless situations remains an open question. Archaeological evidence sometimes provides tantalizing hints about the reality behind these stories. In several frontier cabin sites, researchers have found arrangements of objects that seem to have been placed deliberately as offerings or markers. Collections of stones arranged in patterns near doorways, small bundles of twigs and feathers hung from rafters, even simple wooden crosses carved and placed in specific locations around the property. These discoveries suggest that frontier families developed their own systems of spiritual protection, creating physical markers of hope and faith that help them psychologically navigate their harsh circumstances. The winter preservation techniques used by frontier families also hold mysteries that food historians are still trying to understand. While we know the basic methods, salting, smoking, drying, and root cellar storage, some families seem to have developed unique variations that allowed their food to last longer or taste better than what their neighbors achieved. Archaeological analysis of preserved food containers sometimes reveals trace elements that suggest the use of unknown additives or unexpected preparation methods. In one Montana homestead, researchers found the remains of a winter food storage system that included ceramic crocks containing what appeared to be fermented vegetables. But the fermentation process used doesn't match any known European or Native American techniques. Chemical analysis revealed the presence of specific bacterial cultures that would have been difficult to maintain accidentally, suggesting that the family had developed a deliberate and sophisticated food preservation method. How they learned this technique, whether they invented it themselves or learned it from some unknown source, remains a mystery. The tools used for these preservation techniques also hold secrets. Some frontier families crafted specialized implements for winter food preparation that show remarkable ingenuity and engineering skill. Wooden presses for extracting moisture from vegetables, carved containers designed to maintain specific temperatures for fermentation. Even primitive refrigeration systems that used the natural cold to maintain controlled storage conditions. These tools represent hours of planning and careful construction, suggesting that the families who made them had developed sophisticated understanding of food science through trial and error. But perhaps the deepest mystery of frontier winter lies in the psychological strategies that allowed people to maintain hope and sanity during months of extreme hardship. The physical evidence left behind, the carefully preserved teeth, the mysterious carved discs, the unexplained arrangements of stones, all suggest that frontier families developed complex inner lives, rich symbolic systems, and profound spiritual resources that help them survive, not just physically but emotionally. These mysteries remind us that the frontier winter experience was far more nuanced and complex than simple survival stories suggest. The people who endured these harsh conditions were not just struggling to stay alive, they were creating culture, developing art, maintaining faith, and finding ways to preserve their humanity under the most challenging circumstances imaginable. The objects they left behind, puzzling though they may be, represent the triumph of the human spirit over adversity, the determination to create meaning and beauty even in the midst of hardship. As we contemplate these mysteries floating through the quiet darkness of time, we're reminded that the past is never completely knowable. The frontier winter holds its secrets close, revealing just enough to intrigue us, while keeping the full truth of those experiences forever beyond our reach. In that unknowing and those unanswered questions, we find a kind of peace, the recognition that some mysteries are meant to remain mysterious, that some stories are best told through the silent testimony of objects left behind by hands. We'll never shake voices, we'll never hear lives that touched eternity during those long, quiet winters on the edge of the world. As our journey through the frostbound past draws toward its gentle close, let us step quietly into a different world, one that existed at the very same time as the frontier struggles we've witnessed, yet separated by a gulf wider than the miles between them. While settlers huddled around failing fires and counted their remaining beans, other Americans passed these same winter months surrounded by warmth, abundance, and the elaborate rituals of privilege. This is the story of winter's two faces, and the strange dance between comfort and deprivation that defined a nation. In the grand houses of Boston's Beacon Hill, winter arrived with entirely different rhythms. Picture the Cabot Mansion on a January evening in 1847. The same year, Narcissa Whitman was tending her mission fire with wood split by her own hands. Here, gaslight flickers through tall windows fitted with real glass. Not oiled paper, but clear panes that reveal a world transformed by snow into something resembling a fairy tale. The furnaces in the basement burn steadily, fed by coal, delivered weekly by horse-drawn wagons, their heat rising through carefully designed ducts to warm every room in the house. Mrs. Eleanor Cabot moves through her domain, dressed in layers of silk and wool that would represent a fortune to frontier families. Her winter gown is lined with fur, trimmed with lace imported from Brussels, and accessorized with jewelry that catches the light like captured stars. The children rose, sheiked from their morning sleigh ride in the common, or being prepared for their afternoon lessons by governesses whose salaries could feed a frontier family for months. Yet none of this luxury feels extraordinary to those who inhabit it. It is simply the natural order of their world, as unremarkable to them as splitting kindling was to the settlers. The contrast becomes even more pronounced when we examine the food that graces these elite tables during the harshest months of winter. While frontier families carefully rationed their salt pork and counted beans, Boston's wealthy enjoyed fresh oysters shipped in barrels of ice from the coast, beef roasts that would have fed a frontier family for weeks, and vegetables maintained in elaborate greenhouses heated throughout the winter months. The Cabot dinner table might feature fresh bread made with fine white, flour butter churned from cream, delivered that morning preserves, made from fruits that frontier children had never tasted, and wines imported from Europe at costs that exceeded most settlers' entire annual income. The social rituals surrounding these winter feasts were as elaborate as the food itself. Dinner parties became theater productions where every detail, from the arrangement of silver on damask tablecloths to the precise timing of course presentations, demonstrated the host family's position in society's hierarchy. Ladies changed their gowns between courses, gentlemen retired to wood-paneled libraries for brandy and cigars, and conversations flowed around topics of art, literature, and politics, while frontier families were fortunate to exchange a few words with neighbors they might not see for months. The drawing rooms of these grand houses became centers of winter entertainment that would have seemed fantastical to frontier dwellers. Piano recitals were performed on instruments worth more than most homesteads, their polished surfaces reflecting the light of dozens of candles. Ladies occupied their winter afternoons with elaborate needlework, not the desperate mending that consumed frontier women, but decorative arts created purely for beauty and the demonstration of refined leisure. They embroidered silk cushions with threads of gold and silver, created tapestries that told classical stories, and worked in petty points so fine it required magnifying glasses and perfect lighting. The gentlemen of these households pursued their own refined winter activities. Private libraries, heated to perfect comfort and illuminated by the finest oil lamps, became retreats where they could read the latest books imported from London and Paris. Some maintained private art collections and galleries designed specifically for winter viewing, where paintings could be appreciated by carefully controlled lighting that enhanced every brushstroke. They wrote letters on paper so fine it felt like silk, using pens crafted from precious materials and ink mixed to their personal preferences. The servants who maintained these bastions of comfort lived in a strange middle world between elite luxury and frontier hardship. They enjoyed regular meals and heated rooms, protections from weather that frontier families could only dream of. Yet their lives were constrained by rigid hierarchies and endless labor that served others. Comfort rather than their own survival. The kitchen staff worked in basement rooms that were warm from constant cooking fires, but filled with the steam and smoke of preparing elaborate meals. Housemaids climbed endless stairs, carrying coal for bedroom fires, water for washing, and linens that required daily changing. These servants often came from families that had experienced frontier conditions themselves, or from Irish and German immigrant communities that had fled hardships in their home countries, only to find different forms of struggle in American cities. Their letters home, when they could write at all, described a world of abundance they served, but could not fully share. Comfort they maintained, but could not claim as their own. They slept in unheated attic rooms, ate the leftovers from meals they had prepared but could not afford, and wore uniforms made from fabrics finer than any clothes they had owned before entering service. The children of elite families experienced winter as a season of special treats and elaborate entertainments. They ice skated on private ponds maintained just for their pleasure, took sleigh rides through snow-covered parks, and attended children's balls where they learned the social graces that would define their adult lives. Their winter wardrobes included specialized clothing for every activity: fur-lined cloaks for outdoor excursions, silk dancing slippers for evening entertainment, and multiple changes of clothing for different times of day. A single child's winter wardrobe might represent more wealth than a frontier family would see in years of harsh labor, yet these pampered children were also being prepared for lives of responsibility that frontier children might find foreign. They studied French with native speakers, learned to play musical instruments that required years of dedicated practice, and received instruction in subjects like art history, classical literature, and philosophy that had little practical application. It marked them as members of the educated class. Their days were as structured as those of frontier children, but filled with lessons, tutoring, and social obligations rather than the life or death tasks of survival. The religious observances of elite families during winter took forms that would have seemed almost sacrilegious to frontier believers, who associated faith with hardship and sacrifice. Churches in wealthy neighborhoods were heated to comfortable temperatures, filled with professionally trained choirs and decorated with flowers maintained in winter greenhouses. The sermons focused on spiritual refinement and charitable duty rather than the stark themes of survival and divine providence that characterized frontier worship. Congregations dressed in their finest clothes contributed money rather than labor to church projects, and experienced faith as one element of a cultured, comfortable life, rather than as the desperate anchor that kept them alive through impossible circumstances. The charitable activities of these elite families created one of the few bridges between their comfortable world and the harsh realities faced by others. Lady societies organized relief efforts for the poor, collecting funds and supplies that were distributed to struggling families in the city's less fortunate neighborhoods. They've prepared baskets of food for needy families, organized clothing drives for children whose parents couldn't afford proper winter wear, and visited almshouses where they offered comfort and assistance to those who had fallen into poverty. Yet these charitable efforts, well-intentioned though they were, revealed the vast gulf between the givers and receivers. The food donated might consist of delicacies that poor families didn't know how to prepare, clothes that required maintenance skills they had never learned, and books written for audiences with educational backgrounds far beyond their reach. The elite ladies who performed these acts of charity often returned to their heated carriages and comfortable homes with a sense of having done their Christian duty, while those they helped continued to face daily struggles that their benefactors could barely imagine. The medical care available to elite families during winter months represented perhaps the starkest contrast with frontier conditions. While settlers faced illness with home remedies and desperate prayers, wealthy families employed personal physicians who made house calls carrying bags filled with the latest medicines imported from European pharmacies. Their sick rooms were kept at constant, comfortable temperatures, equipped with specialized furniture designed for patient care, and staffed with professional nurses who provided round-the-clock attention. The pharmaceutical supplies available to these families would have seemed magical to frontier dwellers. Laudanum for pain relief, quinine for fevers, and various tonics and elixirs that promised to cure everything from melancholy to digestive complaints. While frontier families might have a few basic herbal remedies and whatever folk medicine knowledge they could remember, elite households maintained medicine chests stocked with dozens of preparations, each in its own labeled bottle with precise instructions for use. The educational opportunities available to elite children during winter created entire worlds of learning that frontier children never experienced. Private tutors, often European immigrants with university educations, provided instruction in subjects that went far beyond the basic literacy and arithmetic that frontier families struggled to teach their own children. These privileged students learned Latin and Greek, studied advanced mathematics, explored natural sciences through experiments conducted with expensive apparatus, and received training in arts and music that required costly instruments and materials. The libraries available to these students contained thousands of volumes, carefully selected and regularly updated with the latest publications from around the world. They had access to maps, atlases, and scientific instruments that allowed them to explore geography, astronomy, and other subjects through hands-on learning. Their education included exposure to ideas, cultures, and possibilities that would shape them into leaders of business, politics, and society. While frontier children were fortunate to learn basic skills that would help them survive in harsh environments, the transportation available to elite families transformed their experience of winter from an ordeal to be endured into a season to be enjoyed. Private carriages equipped with heated foot warmers, fur blankets, and glass windows allowed them to travel in comfort regardless of weather conditions. They could visit friends across the city, attend theater performances and social events, and maintain active social lives that connected them with others of their class. The isolation that defined frontier winter experience was completely foreign to their way of life. The cultural activities available in cities like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia during winter months created rich intellectual and artistic environments that sustained elite families through the dark months. Opera houses and theaters presented professional performances by artists imported from Europe. Art galleries and museums offered exhibitions that changed regularly. Providing new experiences throughout the winter season, literary salons brought together writers, philosophers, and educated citizens for discussions that explored the latest ideas in politics, science, and culture. These cultural opportunities weren't just entertainment. They were essential elements in maintaining the social bonds and intellectual development that defined elite society. The conversations that took place in heated drawing rooms and elegant dining rooms shaped political opinions, business decisions, and social movements that would affect the entire nation. While frontier families focused on immediate survival, elite families were planning and implementing changes that would determine the country's future direction. The financial resources that supported this comfortable lifestyle came from investments, businesses, and properties that generated wealth without requiring direct physical labor from the families who benefited. Bank ownership, manufacturing enterprises, shipping companies, and real estate holdings provided income that arrived regularly, regardless of weather conditions or seasonal challenges. This economic security allowed elite families to plan for the future, invest in education and cultural development, and maintain lifestyles that remained stable year after year. Yet even within this world of privilege, winter presented its own challenges and constraints. The same storms that threatened frontier families with death also disrupted the supply chains that brought luxuries to elite households. Ships carrying European goods might be delayed for weeks by Atlantic storms. Communication with business partners in other cities could be interrupted for days or weeks. When telegraph lines went down or mail routes became impassable, the carefully orchestrated social seasons could be disrupted when weather prevented travel or when illness struck families who had never developed the hardy constitutions that frontier life demanded. The psychological experience of elite winter, while vastly more comfortable than frontier conditions, carried its own forms of stress and dissatisfaction. Wealthy families often struggled with boredom, social pressures, and the weight of maintaining appearances that could be as exhausting as physical labor. The elaborate social rituals required constant attention to detail, perfect performance of prescribed roles, navigation of complex hierarchies, where a single mistake could result in social ostracism. Children growing up in this environment faced pressures to achieve perfection in areas where frontier children never competed. But they also missed the character-building challenges that came from facing genuine hardship. The servants and workers who made elite comfort possible often came from backgrounds that included frontier experiences or similar hardships. Irish immigrants fleeing famine, German families seeking better opportunities, and Americans from rural areas who had been forced to leave farming by economic pressures, all found themselves working in grand houses where they provided services they had never imagined needing themselves. Their presence in elite households created daily reminders of the different worlds that existed within the same country, the same season, sometimes even the same city. These workers carried with them knowledge and skills developed under harsh conditions. The ability to make something from nothing, to work efficiently with minimal resources, to endure discomfort without complaint. Their presence enriched elite households in ways that went beyond simple labor, bringing practical knowledge and hearty perspectives that balance the sometimes precious refinement of privileged life. Yet the social barriers that separated servants from employers remained rigid, creating relationships that were intimate in daily contact, but distant in terms of real understanding or friendship. The waste generated by elite winter lifestyle would have horrified frontier families, who conserved every scrap and repurposed every item until it literally fell apart. Food that didn't meet aesthetic standards was discarded rather than preserved. Clothing that went out of fashion was replaced regardless of its condition. Fuel was burned lavishly to maintain comfort rather than carefully rationed to ensure survival. This abundance created its own form of moral challenge for sensitive members of elite families, who sometimes struggled with guilt about their privileges, while being unable or unwilling to give them up. As winter progressed towards spring in these comfortable households, the transition was marked by social rituals and cultural celebrations, rather than the desperate relief that characterized frontier experiences. The first spring flowers were brought in from heated greenhouses to decorate drawing rooms weeks before they appeared naturally outdoors. New wardrobes were commissioned from fashionable dressmakers and tailors, who had spent the winter months creating garments for the upcoming social season. Plans were made for spring travel, summer residence arrangements, and the elaborate entertaining that would mark the warm months ahead. The knowledge that spring would come was never in doubt for elite families, as it sometimes was for frontier dwellers. Their comfort was guaranteed by financial resources rather than dependent on weather, crops, or the successful preservation of limited supplies. This security allowed them to experience winter as one season in an endless cycle of predictable abundance, rather than as an annual test of survival that might end in death or disaster. Yet in quiet moments, when the gaslight dimmed and the servants retired to their quarters, even the most privileged families might find themselves contemplating the vast distances, geographical and social, that separated them from their fellow Americans struggling through the same winter months under such different circumstances. Perhaps a mother tucking her well-fed children into beds warmed by heated stones would think of children sleeping in unheated cabins. Or a gentleman reading by his comfortable fire might wonder about families whose fires were fed by wood they had split themselves with aching hands. These moments of awareness created a complex web of connection and separation that defined the American experience during the frontier period. The same storms that brought gentle snow to city parks brought deadly blizzards to isolated homesteads. The same months that meant social seasons and cultural enrichment for some meant struggle and survival for others. The same country contained both worlds, both experiences, both versions of what it meant to be American during the harsh beauty of winter. In the end, both the frontier struggle and elite comfort were authentic American experiences, shaped by the same historical moment, but lived according to vastly different circumstances. The settlers who split wood with bleeding hands and the ladies who embroidered silk by gaslight were all part of the same national story, all contributing to the complex tapestry of American life during one of its most challenging and transformative periods. The winter that ended for both groups with the first warm days of spring left different marks on different lives, but it connected all Americans through the shared experience of enduring winter's test. Whether that test came in the form of life-threatening hardship or the more subtle challenges of maintaining humanity and purpose within the constraints of privilege and comfort. And so we come to the gentle end of our journey through the frost-bound corridors of time, where we have walked softly among the shadows of those who knew winter not as a season to be enjoyed, but as a test to be survived. The snow that once threatened to bury entire homesteads in silence now falls only in our imagination. And the fires that once meant the difference between life and death now flicker only in the warm glow of memory. How strange it is to contemplate the distance we have traveled, not just through these few hours of quiet storytelling, but across the vast gulf of years that separates us from those frontier winters. The settlers who split wood with bleeding hands, the missionaries who learned faith through isolation, the families who transformed scraps of fabric into quilts that would outlive them. All of these lives have dissolved into the same peaceful silence that once surrounded their snow-covered cabins. Yet something of their experience lingers still, doesn't it? In the hush of falling snow, in the satisfaction of a warm room on a cold night, in the simple pleasure of abundant food and reliable heat, we carry echoes of their struggles and their quiet victories. The comfort we take for granted, the touch of a thermostat that summons warmth, the abundance of a well-stocked pantry, the certainty that help is only a phone call away. These ordinary miracles would have seemed like magic to those who measured their lives in degrees of cold and counted their survival in days rather than years. The mysteries we have contemplated, those carved wooden discs, holding their secrets, those quilts with their hidden messages, those careful arrangements of stones and bones and preserved teeth, remind us that the human heart finds ways to create meaning, even in the most desperate circumstances. Perhaps those frontier families were not so different from us, after all. They too sought beauty, created art, told stories, and found ways to transform suffering into something that could be endured, even treasured. Think of Narcissa Whitman in her mission house, writing letters by candlelight to family members she might never see again, yet finding in that act of communication a bridge across impossible distances. Think of the unnamed settlers who gathered around their hearth fires to share stories, creating mythologies of hope and survival that helped them believe in tomorrow. Think of the children who learned to find joy in simple things, the dance of firelight on cabin walls, the taste of honey saved for special occasions, the comfort of voices raised together in familiar songs. Their world was harsher than ours in ways we can barely imagine, yet it was also simpler in ways that sometimes seem enviable. They knew exactly what mattered: warmth, food, shelter, and the precious company of those who shared their exile from comfort. They had no choice but to live in the present moment, to find satisfaction in immediate tasks, to measure success by the most basic standards of human survival. Even those who lived in heated mansions and dined on delicacies, while frontier families counted beans, even they were shaped by the same winter that tested the settlers. The contrast between comfort and hardship was part of the same American story, the same national experiment in creating new ways of life in a vast and challenging landscape. The ladies who embroidered silk by gaslight and the women who mended patches by firelight were separated by circumstances but connected by their shared humanity, their common need to find purpose and beauty in the midst of winter's long rain. The servants who carried coal up endless stairs and the settlers who chopped their own wood both understood labor in ways that we have largely forgotten. They knew the weight of necessity, the satisfaction of tasks completed despite difficulty, the deep sleep that comes to bodies that have been pushed to their limits in service of survival. Their hands were calloused in ways ours are not, but their sense of accomplishment was perhaps deeper than what our easier lives typically provide. As we settle into the warmth and comfort of our modern winters, perhaps we can carry with us some of the resilience those earlier Americans developed through their trials. Not that we should wish for their hardships, the cold that killed, the hunger that weakened, the isolation that sometimes drove people to despair. But we might embrace something of their appreciation for simple pleasures, their ability to find joy in small victories, their understanding that survival itself is a kind of success worth celebrating. The frontier winter is gone now, existing only in museums and history books, in the artifacts that archaeologists continue to uncover. And in stories like the one we have shared tonight, those cabins have fallen into ruin, those fires have burned to cold ash, those voices have joined the eternal silence that embraces all things. Yet their legacy lives on in the strength and character of the nation they helped to build, in the traditions they passed down, and in the quiet courage they demonstrated in the face of impossible odds. When you wake tomorrow morning to warmth that arrives at the touch of a button, when you open your refrigerator to find abundance that frontier families could not have imagined, when you step outside into winter weather, wearing clothes that would have been luxury beyond the dreams of settlers, perhaps you will remember them for just a moment, Perhaps you will feel a flash of gratitude, not just for your comforts, but for the struggles of those who came before you, who endured so much so that eventually someday, winter would become a season to enjoy, rather than merely survive. The snow still falls in the high country, on abandoned foundations and forgotten graves, on the ruins of root cellars and the remains of split-rail fences. It falls with the same silence that once brought both peace and terror to those frontier families, covering their memory with the same gentle hand that once covered their struggles. But in that silence, if we listen carefully, we can still hear the echo of their voices around long cold fires, still feel the warmth of their determination to continue, still touch the hope that carried them through the darkest months toward the promise of spring. Sleep well then, warmed by their memory, comforted by their example. Grateful for the path they carved through winter's wilderness toward the abundance we now enjoy. Let their quiet courage be your lullaby, their endurance, your comfort, their faith in tomorrow, your guide into restful dreams. The frontier winter may be over, but its lessons remain, gentle as falling snow, persistent as the human spirit. Eternal is the cycle of seasons that brings both hardship and healing, struggle and rest, cold and warmth, winter and the spring that always, eventually, comes again. Rest now in the knowledge that you are connected to their story, heir to their strength, beneficiary of their sacrifice. Close your eyes and let the silence surround you. Not the threatening silence of frontier isolation, but the peaceful silence of a winter night in a warm, safe place, where their struggles have become your security, their hardships your comfort, their winter your gentle pathway into sleep. The fire they tended so carefully has become the warmth that holds you now. The spring they waited for through so many dark months has become the eternal promise that difficult times pass, that patience is rewarded, that morning always comes. Sleep well and dream of spring.